When you're the artsy one in your family or your friend group, you get called on for some wild and amazing random projects. Everything from custom party invitations to helping out with Halloween costumes or making a fake stained glass window skylight for your dad's hippie van. I come from a family that is hardcore into cars. As long as I can remember, spring and summer was car show season, and it seemed like every weekend they were hitting up at least one car show, whether that was just to walk around and see all the cars that were actually there or to bring their own. But growing up, I was definitely more into art and dance than I was into cars, so I didn't really get sucked up into that world like the rest of them did, but I definitely got to reap the benefits. For instance, it wasn't until after college when I moved to a whole nother state that I actually had to pay for an oil change, which, bonus, and every single car I have driven since I was 16 had at least a custom pinstripe, if not a full-blown custom paint job. But the leopard spot stripe on my hatchback does not hold a candle to my dad's van. It's called the Magic Dragon. Think Mystery Machine from Scooby-Doo, but dragon scale. This is actually the second version of the car. He actually completed it years ago, but if you know anything about car people, they are constantly tweaking and improving their project car. This is very true with my dad, and he has a whole bunch of new improvements that he wants to do with the whole 2.0 version of the van, and I've gotten swept up into one of those projects. I was a little involved with the first version of the van. I helped him create the typography on the side that says Magic Dragon, and I created the dragon fink for him. A classic symbol for hot rods is a rat fink. It's a little character that was created by the artist Ed Roth. He created a ton of illustrations and little comic strips involving his rat fink, and if you're in the car world at all, you've probably seen the little character. And I get my whole artsy side from my dad, and he was always very much encouraging that, so of course he's really into the whole rat fink thing. So as sort of a tribute to Ed Roth, he decided to definitely include this whole dragon fink idea in the van, and since it sort of became his mascot with the original van concept, he definitely wants to continue it into the new version. And while he's going through the trouble of reworking the van, he definitely wants to rework some of the minor issues with the van, one of which is that there aren't a lot of windows in the back of the van, so it's kind of dark back there. So thus the idea to create a skylight. But of course, I am much like my father and very extra, so of course he can't just put a plain, clear glass window. He decided to go with sort of a faux stained glass effect. The obvious subject for that glass was the mascot of the van, the dragon fink, and so while I was home on a visit several months ago, we sort of started brainstorming. Dad's idea was to base the piece off of the famous piece, The Creation of Adam, from the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo and all those wonderful murals on the ceiling. Very cool piece, very, very recognizable. 1 million people around the planet who know nothing about art history recognize that piece. And of course, we're not the first ones to do our own version of it, but I think ours is definitely pretty unique. Since I've never done a stained glass type project, in preparation I recently did this much smaller stained glass piece, and it kind of worked. It was alright, but the product that I used I did not think was going to be sufficient for this much of a larger project. So I ordered this 31-piece gallery glass kit from Plaid. It's supposed to be sort of a stained glass paint. It included a black leading tube, which was definitely going to be helpful. I used sort of a puffy paint or shirt paint for my original piece, and it worked okay and it was fine, but I was hoping that this was going to be a little bit smoother and easier to use and get a little bit more of a consistent sort of end result. I'm also hoping that these colors will have more variety to them. The kit that I used originally had several blues, for instance, but they all looked pretty much identical when they finished drying, and I didn't get a lot of saturation with them at all. So I'm hoping to be able to get more saturation and more variety of color with these, and I'm hoping that they'll be a better quality, so I'll be able to do a little bit of very minor shading. I don't want it to be too cartoony. I want it to be a little bit over the top and fancy. I'm hoping then it'll be a little more ironic and funny because it's a fancy stained glass window of a weird little dragon character. And while I'm doing my part of this project now, I have no idea when the finalized van is going to be hitting the road. So if you want to hear more about the final project and when it's finally finished and the van is good to go, I would subscribe and ring the little bell down below, and you'll be sure to get an email notification when I upload videos in the future. So while we were brainstorming about this a while back, I went ahead and drew up this sketch as our sort of direction that we were heading in. I, of course, didn't have a lot of details about the project at that time. I wasn't exactly sure how big it was going to end up or how much detail I was going to be able to get out of whatever stained glass product I was using, but this was the goal and the direction that we wanted to head in with the Skylight. Now, the window ended up being about 22 inches in diameter, which is clearly much bigger than this sketch, so my first step is actually going to be enlarging the drawing onto a much bigger piece of paper so I can transfer the design onto the glass with the leading. While the figures in this image are pretty detailed, a lot of the background is very vague and loosey-goosey, and there's nothing too specific. So I don't need to have paper that covers this entire piece of plexiglass. Most of the important stuff is happening in the bottom, like 2/3. So if my paper doesn't go all the way to the top of the circle, I'm not going to worry about that so much. So I just took 4 sheets of paper out of an old sketchbook that are going to cover the majority of my space, and I'm going to call that good enough and just sort of eyeball and freehand anything that goes outside of that space. Once I figured out the best layout for the paper, I turned all of the little raggedy edges so that they wouldn't be in my way and taped the 4 sheets together with a little bit of clear packing tape. And then I just flipped to the other side so I wouldn't have to deal with any of those perforated edges or the tape when I'm drawing. Visually, it was very important to me that the 2 touching fingertips should be kind of near the center of the image. And when you're dealing with a circle, of course, that is not always the easiest thing to do. So my first step was to actually make my large piece of paper now somewhat circular to fit inside the window as a whole. So I set it down into the framework and sort of roughly traced out the round edge of the paper. And once I cut it down along my rough pencil lines, I had a fairly semicircular piece of paper other than the flat edges where the paper ended. Then I just folded it in half in 2 places where both ends of my fold would actually hit on a circular point, and that gave me the center of my paper. Then I just sort of had to redraw my image in a much larger scale. Once I had my drawing complete, I moved it to the back of the glass and taped it in a few strategic places around the frame to hold it in place. Then I flipped to the other side of the glass that I'm actually going to be working on and cleaned the surface really well. First with Windex and then with acetone, just to make sure that I got all the dirt and grease off of the surface so that my paint will stick really, really well. And finally, I was ready to start the actual stained glass portion. The first step with that is to do the leading. According to the instructions on the packaging and what definitely seemed to work well for me, you actually sort of hold the bottle slightly above the surface and sort of let the leading fall down onto the glass. And beyond that, I just tried to do some long sweeping lines to keep things as smooth and even as I could. That was not always perfect, but it is what it is, and you're not actually working with lead, so that's a bonus, I guess. This was definitely a step that took some time. I had to make sure that I wasn't running my arm through any of my wet lead, and I had to work in sort of little quick stages and really try to do some nice long continuous lines whenever I possibly could. It also became very clear that you're not going to get a lot of detail and very fine shapes. Even the example on the packaging were pretty graphic, blocky, simple shapes. So I was probably expecting way too much out of this product, but once I got going, I realized I was going to have to sort of simplify my original design a little bit. But I was able to keep all the big important aspects that I think will really tell the story that we were going for here, and a lot of it is going to be just the characters and the color anyway. So after I let the leading dry, I was ready to move on to the actual painting portion. My kit came with several of the more basic colors in larger tubs and then smaller tubs of a wider variety of shades. And since I really don't know how this product is going to work, I've decided to start with the background or sort of sky area. That whole area is very loose, there's no real definition or detail there, so I can really experiment and get a feel for the product before moving on to any of the more important areas. So the actual background of this image is supposed to be sort of a swirling spiral of blue sky and white cloud, and I'm hoping to be able to get a little bit of fogged edge between the blue and the white by doing a lot of thin layers. Full disclosure, that is not the way the packaging says to use this. The instructions say basically to fill in the entire sort of cell area in a leaded space. So for instance, all of Ed Roth's hair should be filled in at once with one thick layer that fills all the way to the top edge of the leading. Obviously, that will not lead to any sort of shading, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to just sort of gradually build up some shades and then have some little bit of layered translucent bits that will lead to some shading. As I worked on the sky, it became pretty clear that wasn't likely to happen. The product is very sort of gelatinous, so it's very streaky in thin amounts, and if you get it thin enough where you don't end up with some very obvious brush strokes, you get like zero saturation or color out of it. So I was sort of able to get sort of softened edges between the blue and the white of the clouds, but it wasn't really up to the standard that I was hoping for, and it made it pretty clear that I wasn't going to be able to get a lot of that in the rest of the piece. I did experiment as I went along with the project, but a couple things were becoming clear. First of all was that this was going to take a lot of product, and I was doing a very large piece. And on the dragon's skin, I went with more like what the directions said and did the thicker amount, but instead of trying to smooth out the surface with a brush, I kind of dabbed it a little bit, hoping for sort of a dragon scale effect. I was also a little bit nervous about that because the product, as I applied it, was pretty dull green, and I was really hoping for a more bright emerald green. But I was happy to see that apparently the product does sort of oxidize a good bit. And much later, after it had dried for quite a few hours, it did turn a much brighter green, which I was happy about because obviously the dragon is sort of the key of the piece. I'm a little less happy with the Ed Roth portion of the picture though. Some of the colors, like the green of the dragon's skin and the blue for the sky, ended up really bright and true to the swatches that are on the box, but some of them definitely did not live up to what they were supposed to be on the packaging. For instance, a color that claims to be sort of a charcoal black, which obviously is not supposed to be black like the leading, but is shown to be a very dark gray, Did not get anywhere near that. I did attempt to lay a little bit of that down in some shadowy areas on their little togas that they're wearing, hoping that it would oxidize a lot more like the dragon's skin did, but it really didn't. Unless you really gunk that in there, you're not going to get any real color at all out of that one. So there wasn't really a good color for Ed Roth's skin. I kind of went with what was labeled as ivory. It did end up with a little more color to it than the pearly white that I used for their togas, but not by a lot. The colors I used for Ed's hair and the fabric draped behind him were supposed to be a sort of dark chocolatey brown and a sort of burgundy red. Obviously, neither of those really quite reached that point. I'm reasonably satisfied with where they are. They obviously have a brownish quality and a reddish quality. There is a little bit of saturation with each of them, so I'm not too disappointed in them, but it does show that you can't necessarily go by the swatches on the packaging, which made me a little nervous to try and mix any of my own colors, like for instance to get any sort of a skin tone for Ed, so I just stuck with the ivory. Is it a little strange and pale? Yes, but I think that's better than if I had gotten a little too experimental and ended up with some really strange alien skin tone. And I know this probably is not reading very well on camera, but overall I'm pretty happy with where it ended up. I think the green of the dragon ended up pretty saturated and nice, so that's nice because he is kind of the feature focal reason of this piece, and the whole Ed Roth portion turned out okay. As I said, you can't really get a ton of detail and you can't really do any shading, so most people are probably not going to know who he is, but most people don't know who he is anyway, so it's still kind of funny, and even if they recognize the sort of rat fink style of the dragon, that's really the important part, and overall I'm pretty happy with where this ended up. So the Magic Dragon Skylight is complete, or at least my part of it, and really that's all that matters to me. I hope you enjoyed watching me experiment with this really different project. If you did, please like the video down below. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time.